A 6.5-hour EVA. On this EVA, Dan egresses the airlock and then Scott comes out second. The first main objective is to detach P6 from Z1, so the arm grapples P6, and Scott and Dan begin demating cables right after getting out of the hatch. There are 9 cables, which answers the earlier question, that need to be demated in order for P6 to separate from Z1. Dan generally stays high, and you can see him up in the upper part here, and Scott stays low. They're actually swapping cables for caps that have been stowed on Z1. Some of the cables might be a little stiff, but for most of them, the major task is really getting them tucked close to structure at the end of the procedure. After that, Scott closes a capture latch to hold P6 on a Z1 while they go around the P6-Z1 interface, disconnecting grounding strap bolts and demating the 4 main bolts that have been holding P6 onto Z1 since it was first installed. These are called RTAS bolts. RTAS stands for Rocketdyne Truss Attachment System. And we're planning to use a ratchet wrench with a handle extension to break the torque on these main bolts. After the last bolt's removed, Scott opens the capture claw, and Stephanie and Wheels move P6 up away from Z1 using Canada Arm 2 for its first move in the relocation process. After this, the EV crew members separate, and Dan goes up onto the truss to perform 3 short but important tasks. First, he goes to the starboard S1 truss element. Here he'll be reconfiguring some connectors for a squib firing unit. The connectors are located between the S1 radiator beam here in the foreground and the S1 truss, which as we rotate around will be on his left. After performing this connector swap, the S1 outboard radiators can later be deployed using ground commands. Then Dan heads to the S0 truss, and he actually enters into the truss. In the truss, there are electrical lines that need to be rerouted so P6 can be activated when it's out on P6. You can see the flashing connectors in the zenith and nadir parts of this bay. Although it's a tight squeeze, we've sent crew members into this bay previously to perform similar reconfigurations. And Dan just needs to use caution not to bump into lines and connectors while he's inside the truss. Then he'll egress the truss and begin heading off to his third task in this string of EVA tasks. That task is the changeout of a critical power control box. This box needs to be exchanged with a new box before the station robotic arm can use a grapple fixture on Node 2 Harmony as its base. Meanwhile, Scott went over to Node 2, which is newly installed onto the port side of Node 1. Node 2 needs to be externally outfitted and readied for future spacewalks and berthing operations on its ports. At the end of the EVA, Dan comes over and helps with this outfitting as well. The newly installed items are 11 handrails, 2 straps called gap spanners, 3 worksite interfaces or WIFs, an electrical connector, and 5 small trunnion and keel pin covers. They brought these items over in bags that they prepped inside, pulling them out 2 or 3 items at a time to save trips. Scott will also remove 4 pins, 1 from each of the radial berthing mechanisms, and he'll release the zenithmost berthing pedal launch restraints. They'll also remove 16 caps from under the large MLI covers that you see flashing on the right. When Dan gets done on the truss, Scott will stop work temporarily on this outfitting, and then he and Dan will detach the grapple fixture that they'd installed on Harmony for its ride to space station. It's been held on by tethers since EVA 1. Together they move it down to the nadir side of Node 2, where you can see that flashing ring. They'll install 4 fasteners to hold it in place, and then attach 2 connectors that were previously loosened in the payload bay. This later allows the SSRMS to be based on this grapple fixture for future robotics operations. At the end of the EVA, they both take their empty bags back to the airlock. Scott will go into the airlock first, followed by Dan. So at the end of this EVA, P6 is in transit, and Dan's next EVA will be in the stage with Peggy a few days after shuttle undocking. After EVA 2, the crew works on relocating P6 down to the port end of the truss, just shy of berthing it onto P5.